Hi, Grandma here, and I'm going to wrap up Crispin. We finished with the story, but there is there are a few pages that I wanted to read that were part of the historical notes. So this is kind of the afterword. So this was written by the author, and it's the information that he researched in order to write the book. To write a historical book like this, you have to do an awful lot of research on the history of the era, and you don't necessarily use all that information, but it helps set the scene. So this is the historical note. In many respects, modern European history, its art, philosophy, politics, literature, and religion, had its roots in the 14th century. In 1377, the time of the story, the Kingdom of England was in the midst of a great crisis, as was all of Europe. The old king, Edward III, was dying. The heir to the throne was his grandson, a boy who at the age of 10 could be crowned Richard II. King Edward III had led his country into what historians would later call the Hundred Years' War, a dynastic struggle for land and power between England and the country we now call France. Not only was it ruinous to the common people, it wreaked havoc upon the English economy because the king was forced to impose heavy and very unpopular taxes upon all classes to raise money for its armies. In the same period, almost all of Europe, including England, was still recovering from the Black Death, the recurring waves of bubonic plague that killed at least a third, and in many cases, even half of the population. I'm going to have an aside here. I'm a genealogist, and it's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to trace your family tree back any further is because of the plague. All of us who are European descend from a very small group of people in the 13th and 14th century. In the 14th century, the 1300s, because so many died in the plague. Anyway, go on. There was also a climactic shift that caused long periods of dreadful weather, constant cold and rain, which in turn reduced crop production and therefore caused food and fodder shortages. Fodder, by the way, is animal food. Starvation was rampant, and for the small numbers of those who ruled, they were fabulously rich. If these calamities were not enough, the European Christian church, what we today call the Catholic Church, was in great turmoil, with the contending existence of two popes, one in Italy, the other in France. Each one was backed by warring political factions. All this led to a great desire for reform inside and outside of the church. Corruption, death, and cruelty were everywhere in both secular and religious society. It has been suggested that the only period to witness an equal amount of devastation was the 20th century. In England, there was a desire for change too. In the realm of religion, a group of people known as the Lollards emerged. They wanted major reforms in the church, including an end of corruption and a return to what they believed were original Christian practices, based on simplicity and biblical injunction. It was, in short, the beginning of the Reformation. That's the Protestant church. In many places in Europe, there were violent peasant uprisings. In southern England, just 4 years after the time of the story, a great revolution erupted, later known as the Peasants Revolution of 1381. The peasants demanded, among other things, an end to serfdom, as well as far greater political equality. They were almost successful. The historical record suggests that the revolt was as spontaneous as it was murderous. The notion of a brotherhood conspiring to ferment revolution, as told in this story, is my invention, but surely such talk was common. My being Ave's invention. The short-lived rebellion of 1381 was terribly bloody, both in the acts committed by the rebels and in their suppression. One of the key leaders of the Peasants' Revolt was John Ball, the only historical person in this story. He was the one who was in charge of the meetings that Bear went to. When the revolution failed, he was executed. While we do not know when John Ball was born, we do know he was an English priest who was well known for preaching radical ideas such as the end of the feudal system, serfdom, as well as the common ownership of property. In 1364, he was excommunicated by the Bishop of London, freed, and then again put in prison for life. During the rebellion, he was freed by the rebels and became a leader of the movement in which some 30,000 men took part. A contemporary historian of the period, Jean Froissart, has called John Bull's sermon to the rebels the most moving plea for social equality in the history of the English language. After the rebellion was suppressed, Ball was caught, hanged, that's not all, drawn, and quartered. So after he died by hanging, they then basically pulled him apart into quarters. One example of the era's popular political sentiment, at least among those not in the aristocracy, may be found in the couplet from a sermon delivered on June 13, 1381 by John Ball at Blackheath near London, to the rebels of the 1381 uprising. When Adam Dolph and Ave span, who was then a gentleman. Ball, like his listeners, spoke Middle English. When Adam, Dolph, and Eve span meant when Adam dug and Eve spun. Ball is referring to the book of Genesis in the Bible. After being exiled by God from the Garden of Eden, where they lived naked and could eat fruit from the trees, the first man and woman were forced to work. They had to plant crops to grow their own food, and they had to spin wool and thread to make their own clothing. In the very beginning of society, everyone had to work equally. Ball is saying that when there were only Adam and Eve, there was no upper class, or to put it in more modern terms, all men are created equal. One final note. Crosses of lead are not my invention. You can see a whole case of them on display in the British Museum in London, England. This was all written by Avi, August 19, 2001. In my edition, there's also an interview with Avi where people ask questions and he answers them. And there's also a glossary with words defined. Let me read a couple of these interview questions. So much of your work is historical fiction. What author of the genre do you admire most? That's the question. The ultimate model for all my historical fiction is Robert Louis Stevenson. He epitomizes a kind of storytelling that I dearly love and still read because it's true, it has validity, and beyond all, it is an adventure. And I will agree, Robert Louis Stevenson is certainly an adventure. What special challenge of writing about a different time do you enjoy the most? Well, we don't know fully what life was like, and you have to build a whole style and language to convey something. In other words, the whole thing is a stylistic construction, and you almost invent the language. I originally wrote the book in verse, but it would have been 600 pages. So I took the linguistic structure and recast it back into a traditional narrative. Crispin is set in the 14th century. What attracted you to this place and time? I write historical fiction the way I read history. There has to be something that engages my attention and that I find interesting to begin with. European culture is seeing the emergence of the ego at the time. It's 80 years before the Reformation. I am attempting to write a story that focuses on the Reformation of a culture that is struggling to change its fundamental religious beliefs. I want to show how shocking and difficult that transformation is. There's so much about nationalism emerging that a burst of universities and the seeds of modern culture began sprouting. How do you connect the problem of a 14th century serf to a kid in the 21st century, today? I think the problem of writing historical fiction for young people in particular is how to convey the strictures of that earlier society. The rules of life in the 14th century are so radically different from today that you have to create a context that is understandable. Music is something kids do relate to, and figuring out that there was music at that time is a way for them to connect. How did you communicate the complexities and ubiquity of medieval religion? It was difficult to convey a sense of religion that is ultimately a way of life. It's not open to question and is so absolutely a permanent part of every breath you take. Question. You actually have a real-life character in the story, in the person of John Ball. What are the challenges of including a real person in a fictional story? When I was a freshman in college, a long time ago, I read something about the Peasants Rebellion. I had decided to become a writer, but I was writing plays, and so I wrote a blank verse play about the Peasants Rebellion. I chose John Ball for Crispin because Froissart's Chronicles, a history of the 14th century, contains speeches I could paraphrase, and I felt on firmer ground to expostulate and express his notions. This is going to be the last question. What do you think is valuable to the reader about historical fiction? I'm a believer that if you know there was a past and that it differs from today, there is a built-in inference that change is part of the human experience. So there is change potentially for the future. If you live in a world where change is visible, embedded in that is a philosophy for change. Okay, that's all that I'm going to be reading about Crispin. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you learned a little bit. I personally really like historical fiction and puts history into perspective, and I feel like I've really been there. And I feel like I know a lot more about various time periods by reading historical fiction. Now, there are other books about Crispin, if you enjoyed this book, that you might want to read. Remember, it's by Ave. Sometimes it's easier to look things up with the author. Okay, bye-bye.